In today's lecture, we're going to be exploring economics and Pareto efficiency. And specifically, we're going to be looking at some of the philosophical foundations of our economic models. Before we kind of get into any of the economics pieces, let's take a quick look at this concept of utilitarianism. From the utilitarian perspective, actions are deemed good if they benefit the majority. So if I undertake an action that benefits the majority of the students in this class, it will be deemed a good action according to utilitarianism. Now, this is a philosophy that came about in the middle part of the 18th century. And from this perspective, we can sum the outcomes of actions to determine which outcome is right, which action is right. Okay, so if I do an action and then you do an action, we can take the total benefit that is felt by the people in society, and we can determine if one action is better than the other by comparing the sums of outcomes of those types of actions. Utilitarianism specifically looks at this concept of what is called utility. And utility is the measure of goodness, if you will, or happiness, right? How happy I am can be measured in terms of what are called utils, or units of happiness. So again, this utility is the measure of how happy or how good an action is or makes us. This early philosophical tradition is started with a philosopher by the name of Jeremy Bentham, who famously argued that humans seek pleasure and avoid pain, and we constantly seek more utility. This was followed up by John Stuart Mill, whose broad argument was that the general happiness is the aggregate of all people. So the general happiness of this classroom is the aggregate of all the happinesses of the students within this course. Let's set that aside for just a moment, and we'll look at a little bit of an example of barter exchange before we go back into the utilitarianism. So imagine for a moment if I were to randomly hand out 1,000 CDs of various musical artists. I know many of you don't probably use CDs anymore, so assume it's old vinyl or even MP3s or something. But I randomly hand out 1,000 CDs of various musical artists. Some of you might get 10, some of you get 2. I essentially stand in front of the classroom and throw them out to you. And based upon what you receive after I give these CDs out, you begin to trade based upon your tastes, right? So some of you will trade Lil Wayne for Billie Eilish. Others of you will take your Selena Gomez CD and trade it for a Kendrick Lamar CD. Others might take a Rolling Stone CD and trade it for a Drake CD. Now, after some time, right at the beginning, you might see a lot of trading action as you all try to navigate your tastes with some trades. But after some time, that trading stops. And the point at which that stops might be a situation where not everyone is perfectly happy with the amount of CDs that they have and the musical artists that they have now gained in those exchanges. But there isn't a trade that exists that would make one person happy without making another person happy. So again, this situation in this barter would sort of slow down at a point where not everyone's necessarily happy, but there's no situation where I could trade a CD that wouldn't make me happy in order to make you happy. Okay? So then put that in the side, and we're gonna go into a situation where what if all of a sudden I add 10 more CDs into the crowd, right? If I add 10 more CDs into the crowd, you might be able to get a little happier, and that doesn't mean that anyone else is made less happy because I take 10 new CDs and add them to the situation after this trading has stopped. So we're going to pause that and put it onto the side for a moment, right? So don't forget, we've got utilitarianism. We've got these barter exchanges where we stop when no trade can make someone else better off without making someone else worse off. And we're going to get to this later economist, an early economist who followed from the utilitarian position, named Vilfredo Pareto. He was an Italian economist who said that a system is efficient if no one can be made better off without making someone else worse off. Right? So he sort of followed in that tradition of the example that we were just exploring. But he departed from his early utilitarian thinkers. He started off in this utilitarianism philosophical mindset, and he associated with it, but yet he broke from utilitarianism by arguing that we cannot measure or compare utility. So while the earlier utilitarian thinkers said that we can sum up everyone's utility, Pareto was pretty adamant and said, we can't measure utility. How do you measure happiness? How do you measure goodness? And if we can't measure it, we certainly can't compare it to one another. How do you know, or how would I be able to know how much utility you get from a Selena Gomez CD versus how much I get from a Kendrick Lamar CD? We're not able to compare those utilities. So what Pareto did, which was historically very novel, was he said prices were able to express utility in a way that can be both compared and measured. So essentially, Pareto said prices can become a proxy for utility. We express how much utility we get from consuming a good or service by how much we're willing to pay for that good or service. So when I purchase a Kendrick Lamar CD, I express my utility in the quantity of 10 pounds, for example. And pulling all of this together is where we start to see the philosophical foundation of our modern economic theories, right? Since we can't compare or measure welfare and utility and goodness and happiness, the goal of economics thus becomes to create an allocation of resources in which social utility is maximized as measured by the price value of economic output. And this is very, very important. Economics becomes understanding how do we allocate resources between sectors, between individuals, between paper on one hand or wood for a table on the other. How do we allocate resources such that our social utility, our total happiness is maximized, and that maximization is measured by the price value of our economic output. So the study of economics becomes the science of maximizing utility, right? Consumers, individuals like you and me, when we go to a store, we maximize our utility by consuming. Producers maximize their utility by earning a profit. And therefore, taken together, economic efficiency is when the consumption and profits are maximized and no one can be made better off without making someone else worse off. Now, do we see where this early utilitarianism turns into Pareto efficiency and Pareto optimality of no one being made better off without making someone else worse off? And we see that barter example that we had kind of coming full through with this. And then drawing on Pareto, we see consumers maximizing their utility by consuming according to the price mechanism, and producers maximizing profit, again, according to the price mechanism. So all of these things are sort of working together to get our early foundations of economic science. And this leads into what we call the theorems of welfare economics. And when we talk about welfare economics, that's really the early economic thinking that we're associated with in the neoclassical model, right? When we talk about neoclassical economics, we also call that welfare economics, and we also sometimes refer to it as Walrasian economics after sort of its founder, Leon Walras, who again followed in this tradition. But the theorem of welfare economics, the first one is that the free exchange of commodities in a barter economy will result in Pareto optimality. Right, we saw this example with the CDs, this free exchange of commodities in this barter economy. When that happens, that will result in Pareto optimality, this situation where we can't make one individual better off without making another individual worse off. And the second important theorem of welfare economics is if prices perfectly reflect preferences, Perfectly competitive markets will yield Pareto optimality. And this is important where that deviation of Pareto's from the early utilitarians comes in. Because this theorem argues that if those prices step in as a perfect proxy for our welfare preferences, from consumers consuming, from producers earning profits, then these perfectly competitive markets, which we'll be discussing, will yield the Pareto optimality of this first theorem that is replicated in those barter transactions that we explored with the CD example. Now that's great. That leads us to our beginning, the foundation of our economic sciences. But there are some weaknesses of Pareto efficiency, as I'm sure you're all starting to think about as you watch this video. The first, the initial distribution of goods and services, of resources, is incredibly important. If you recall back to the CD example, I didn't take any concern with to whom I gave these CDs. I just sort of threw them out. Some of you might have gotten one CD in this example. Others might have been able to catch 10 or 15 when I distributed them. The initial distribution is incredibly important, but from the Pareto efficiency perspective, it's not considered, right? So when we think about Pareto efficiency, we need to think and say, well, what was the initial distribution, and was it fair? Was it equitable? Because if we don't consider that, we can get to a Pareto efficient point that might not be what is socially desirable given our goals. Another important weakness of Pareto efficiency is that ecosystems and society feel the effects of these distribution systems. So when we have economic systems that are Pareto efficient, what about the utility of the ecosystem, right? Producers maximize profits, consumers maximize consumption, but what about the utility of the ecosystem? Does a forest get their vote in how their utility is found in this equation? And we gotta think of utility as more than just absolute wealth. It's more than the total of consumption and the total of profit, right? There's the relativity of wealth. Society, and there have been a lot of studies about this, but societies that are more equal are stronger and better off. It's less about the absolute wealth of a society and more about the equitable distribution of that wealth within society. So the second sort of weakness of this Pareto efficiency that we've discussed is that these ecosystems and societies feel the effects of how our economic systems reach efficiency, but those aren't really part of that efficiency model from the Pareto efficiency perspective. And finally, prices are a perfect proxy for utility. Well, what if price doesn't perfectly reveal our preferences, right? What if there are other things that aren't caught up in price, that price isn't able to capture, that is truly important to us? Love, community, thinking about equity, religion, culture. Price doesn't really capture those preferences, and yet those might be very important to us. And again, what if price isn't able to incorporate certain qualities, right? Price might be a good way of putting quantity into our economic models, but what if it's not able to incorporate quality? Is this a good quality product? Does this product respect the structure of the ecosystems and the services that those ecosystems provide? That's a qualitative component that price as a proxy for utility might not be able to capture very well.